Okay, so the article that I chose to present today is entitled Gender, Gender Roles and Anxiety, Perceived Confirmability of Self-Report, Behavioral Avoidance, and Physiological Reactivity. And this was a study performed at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in 2012. So just sort of a background and introduction. Research has demonstrated that women are more susceptible to anxiety disorders. However, little is known about what factors contribute to such a gender effect. One sort of hypothesis is gender socialization, which is basically teaching women to be dependent, fearful, passive, and submissive, whereas men are taught to be more courageous, active, and goal and achievement-oriented. And some studies have shown that femininity is associated with greater fear and anxiety, whereas masculinity or instrumentality is negatively associated with fear and anxiety. But other studies have shown that there's no relationship between femininity and masculinity and level of anxiety. Another variable that might contribute to the gender effect is differential reinforcement, which is similar to gender socialization. It means that it is acceptable for girls to express anxiety and sadness. So these emotions are encouraged or reinforced in females, whereas boys are expected to act courageously and face their fears. So these sort of anxious behaviors are not reinforced. And it is hypothesized that this gives them the opportunity for fear reduction and therefore lower anxiety. And therefore, this creates the possibility that men and women may not equally report anxiety when asked to report anxiety levels. Men might be more inclined to underreport so that they are consistent with their more masculine image, i.e. they're not perceived as being vulnerable or weak. Another variable that might have a gender effect is physiological reactivity. Evidence on this is rather conflicting. Some studies have indicated that men and women experience similar physiological reactivity in response to stress, whereas others have shown that women are more physiologically reactive than men. And a final variable that might contribute to the gender effect is avoidance behavior. Studies have shown that anxious women tend to display more avoidance than men, despite similar levels of fear and distress. So in some studies, men are more inclined to approach a feared stimulus than women are. And this is likely due to the fact that avoidance behavior is reinforced in women but not in men. So in the present study, researchers were interested in measuring explicit and implicit measures of anxiety when individuals are faced with an aversive stimulus or a feared stimulus. So in this case, they chose to have participants approach a harmless tarantula. And so there are three primary goals to this study. The first was to examine whether or not men underreport anxiety. So they attempted to replicate findings from a previous study that men who are told that their heart rate data will verify their subjective responses of how anxious they are will report higher subjective fear than those who are told that their heart rate data is irrelevant. Secondly, the researchers aimed to examine gender effects across multiple domains, and these three domains were subjective anxiety. So they expected that women would report higher levels of fear on a subjective questionnaire or a measure of anxiety. The second is heart rate reactivity, and it was suspected that women would experience greater heart rate reactivity than the men would. And the third domain was behavioral avoidance, and it was expected that women would demonstrate more behavioral avoidance than men would. And finally, the third goal was determining whether masculinity or femininity related to level of anxiety. And it was thought that higher expressivity, or which is typically considered to be a feminine trait, would be associated with greater subjective anxiety, whereas higher instrumentality, which is typically considered a masculine trait, would be associated with lower subjective anxiety. So this was a post-test only independent groups design. Participants were 144 graduate students at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. 67 of the participants were women, 77 were men. The mean age was about 20 years old, and all years of college were represented. However, more freshmen were represented than any other year. And a majority of the students in the study were European American. So how the experiment was set up, participants first completed a variety of questionnaires. The first of which was a fear of spiders questionnaire. And that's an 18-item questionnaire where respondents were asked to indicate their fear and avoidance of spiders on an 8-point scale, 0 being disagree, disagree greatly, and 8 was this statement applies to me, I agree. And the second subjective questionnaire that participants were asked to complete was called a personal attributes questionnaire. And this was to assess gender roles by asking participants to rate various characteristics on a 5-point scale. And this particular test has 3 different subscales. There's a masculinity scale, a femininity scale, and a masculinity scale. And on this particular study, they were interested in only the masculinity and femininity scale. And then after they finished these 2 questionnaires, participants were introduced to the task of approaching a tarantula. And they were given these 9 steps on this behavioral approach test, which are listed in the table above. So approach the spider rapidly, look down at the spider, remove the lid, place both hands on the side of the terrarium and remove the small container, place palm of hand, and gradually working up to touching the spider and allowing it to crawl on your hand for 30 seconds. After the behavioral approach test was explained to them, they were asked to fill out the fear of spiders questionnaire for a second time. And then after that, participants were randomly divided into 2 groups. One group was the verifiable heart rate group, which were participants that were told that heart rate was a good predictor of their physiological reactivity, so they would be measuring physiological reactivity, comparing that to their subjective anxiety level. And then the second group was irrelevant heart rate group, where participants were told that heart rate is not a good predictor of physiological reactivity. Nevertheless, they would still be wearing a heart rate monitor, but it was not suspected that their heart rate would indicate their subjective anxiety level. And the heart rate was measured with monitors throughout the duration of the behavioral approach test. And throughout this behavioral approach test, participants would be asked to give their score on a subjective units of distress scale, which is a scale which rates the level of which participants rate the level of anxiety on a 100-point scale. And this measure was taken 4 times throughout the experiment. It was taken once before they were required to complete the behavioral approach test, and then it was taken again after they approached the spider. It was taken at the end of the experiment, and then they were also asked to report what their peak score was throughout the behavioral approach test. And finally, participants could terminate the behavioral approach test at any time. So if they got uncomfortable at step 6, for example, they could stop at step 6 and didn't have to touch the spider. So the results, there are a lot of complicated statistics here, so I'm going to try to break this down as much as I possibly can. So in order to measure response bias, there were 2 mixed factorial ANOVAs run. And just to go over some vocabulary as maybe review, I don't know, a main effect is an effect of one independent variable on the dependent variable, ignoring all effects of the other dependent variables, or independent variables. And interactions occur when the effect of one independent variable on the dependent variable changes depending on the level of another independent variable. So the first factorial ANOVA was a 2 by 2 by 2. Heart rate group by time, so comparing the first spider questionnaire versus the second spider questionnaire, and also gender. There was a main effect of gender that was significant, and a main effect of time, meaning that women demonstrated higher scores on the spider questionnaire than men did, and the post-test spider questionnaire scores were higher than the pre-test spider questionnaire scores. There was no main effect of heart rate group, so these scores on the spider questionnaire did not vary depending on the heart rate group, and there were no interactions for this ANOVA. And the second ANOVA that they did was a heart rate group gender subjective unit distress scale, so 2 by 2 by 4. There was a main effect of gender, women reporting higher SUDS scores, and time. So as sort of the experiment went on, the SUDS scores increased. And there was, again, no main effect of the heart rate group, so regardless of heart rate, people tended to report the same. And again, no interactions. So they also looked at gender effects. So they did this looking at the personal attributes questionnaire, and they found that there was no difference in femininity or expressivity, but that men scored higher than women on masculinity or instrumentality, which is kind of interesting because you would think that maybe females would score higher on femininity, but there was no difference. So they also looked at heart rate reactivity, and again looked at a mixed factorial ANOVA, and this one was 2x2, gender and heart rate group, and then they found no main effect of gender. So regardless of gender, wait a minute, there was a main effect of time. So heart rate increased as the task became more challenging, but heart rate did not differ by gender. And this is just a table that sort of gives some descriptive statistics and also mentions the inferential statistics sort of on the right side, the F statistics over there. So as you can see, the scores on the behavioral approach test were higher in men, meaning that men were more inclined to approach the spider, and then scores on anxiety levels are much higher and are generally higher in women. Let's see. So they also looked at avoidance behavior. It was found, as I said earlier, that women completed fewer steps on the behavioral approach test, and they also performed a variety of other mixed factorial ANOVAs. I did not include them on the slide because I thought it would be sort of difficult to read and understand. So through these mixed factorial ANOVAs, they concluded that among participants who did not touch the spider, women displayed more heart rate activity than men, but women did not differ from men in heart rate reactivity if they did touch the spider, which was interesting. It was also found that participants who avoided touching the spider had higher peak SUDS scores. Women and men who did not touch the tarantula did not differ on their peak SUDS scores, but women who touched the spider reported higher peak SUDS scores than men who touched the spider. So finally, they looked at the gender role analysis using the personal attributes questionnaire, and they used correlations to look at this data. So they used these correlations to examine the relationship between gender role and their subjective anxiety, or their subjective anxiety scores, and again, they looked at anticipatory, approach, end, and peak. So they found that femininity did not correlate with any kind of measurement. However, masculinity negatively correlated with their peak SUDS scores and end SUDS scores, meaning that people who demonstrated higher masculinity scores had lower SUDS scores. And then it also, masculinity scores also negatively correlated with anticipatory anxiety for women, but not for men, which demonstrates that women high in instrumentality report less anticipatory anxiety in general. So conclusions that could be drawn from this: men did not underreport fear and anxiety when told that their heart rate could verify their responses, because all participants demonstrated higher level of fear on their second spider questionnaire. Women displayed more anxiety and avoidance behavior on the fear-inducing task in general. They had greater scores on the spider questionnaire and greater peak and end scores on the subjective unit distress scale, and greater avoidance on the behavioral approach test. However, something that was interesting was that the gender effect was not present for any anticipatory anxiety. So men and women sort of experience the same, have the same kind of, at least subjective anxiety experience prior to the aversive task. As the task became more challenging, the gender effect became much greater. So women were concordant for physiological arousal and avoidance, but reported high subjective levels of anxiety regardless of whether or not they avoided the spider. This suggests that there may be physiological arousal that drives women's behavior rather than their subjective anxiety. In contrast, men were concordant across subjective anxiety and avoidance, but reported higher physiological arousal when they did not avoid the spider than when they did avoid the spider. Additionally, women who touched the spider said that they felt anxious but had a baseline heart rate, whereas men who touched the spider showed low anxiety but they had a more elevated heart rate. However, no causal statements can be made with regards to these findings. Finally, higher masculinity was associated with less anxiety and avoidance behavior. However, there was no relationship between femininity and anxiety and avoidance. So some limitations in future directions. The researchers thought that maybe the heart rate manipulation was not salient enough. After the test, they asked participants to sort of indicate what they thought the heart rate monitor was for, and it was found that participants were suspicious of the purpose of the heart rate monitor, and particularly in the irrelevant group, they thought, why, since heart rate isn't a good indicator, why are we still being measured with these heart rate monitors? Taking implicit measures of anxiety may also affect an individual's response bias for subjective anxiety. So maybe if they knew they were being recorded, that their heart rate levels would be compared to their compared to their subjective scores, it might affect the way they responded to the task. Finally, or thirdly, there's limited generalizability of the results due to the lack of ethnic diversity, since 86% of the participants were European American, so it can't be generalized to the general public. And self-reporting might not provide accurate information. People might be inclined to over or underreport their level of anxiety based on gender roles, gender socialization, and whatnot. And as far as future directions, researchers thought it might be useful to compare the subjective measures to observational measures, so have researchers examine the individual's behavior and make note to see whether or not what they're observing matches the subjective measures reported by the participants. And finally, another direction that they thought of taking this would be to look at the tend and befriend hypothesis in relationship to avoidance. And this hypothesis suggests that fight or flight stress response may not accurately depict how women behave in response to a stressful situation. Instead, women might display behaviors that would protect and care for their offspring and reduce stress. So this would be a protective for the offspring, but might contribute to a greater avoidance in stressful situations for the women themselves. Befriending or relying on support may prevent women from developing a more independent coping style for stressful situations. So this might be another direction to go in the future when looking at anxiety in women. Thank you, guys.
Okay.